and remarriage. It is not often that this is discussed, because what is mostly discussed is the law of Moses. And our brethren don't know that there is a distinction in that law, and it's something that we don't follow and obey. Yet, it's very interesting. They understand the use of the mechanical instrument of music. They understand about the physical priesthood. They understand about the clothing of the priesthood. They understand about the time of going to services to worship 3 times a year versus every Lord's Day. They understand about the sacrifice that is offered, and that sacrifice is Christ instead of some 4-legged sheep. They understand so much about this, but they have not gotten in their minds what the New Testament teaches concerning these events. Now, the New Testament is a book written to other than the Jew, which in a lot of instances causes us to have more understanding than we would have to begin with. But where I want to start tonight is, if you will look at 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, you will see in verse 13 that pre-existing the 7th chapter, there is a statement made that will have consequence in our study. Them that are without, understood, the church of Christ, God judges. We don't look at that too often, because if we did, when somebody who came to our assemblies who were not raised in the church of Christ and was not taught the gospel of Christ and was not taught the law of Moses concerning marriage and divorce, would have no understanding of where they are or what they're doing. Then there's something else that compounds this chapter in a great extent, and we need to look at that too. Look at verses 28 and 29 of the 7th chapter. Verse 28 and 29. Paul writes, "But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they have none." Then, when we speak of these things, we need to read the 26th verse, because here is the corresponding thought. "I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress." What we're talking about in the present distress is the fall of Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem was soon to be. The book of the Corinthian book, the 1st and 2nd, was written in the 60s, AD 60s, as far as we know and understand. The fall of Jerusalem began in AD 68. Paul was saying, you've asked me a question. I'm glad to answer the question, but the present distress is coming, and when the present distress is coming, it is that will cause a complete different understanding of the situation than it will be. Now, it says here in verse 31, "And they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away." And he said, I'd like to keep you without carefulness. Here's the idea. The circumstances and the events that will take place because of the fall of Jerusalem is going to change the way you look at the questions you've asked. And because of that, you will need to understand that these things are true, and they are things that you can follow, But because of the circumstance that we're about to abide in, what will be true will not be important. Because he says in verse 32, I would that ye would be without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. You're going to be in a different situation if you're married than you would be in if you were not. If you are married, you're going to have in your mind how you're taking care of your wife. And if you have children, the same way. If you're not married, then you're going to not have the burden or the disadvantage or the tug of your heart that this will cause. And therefore the circumstances and situations will cause you to think of things in a different way as you look upon this situation. But let's start. I think the easiest thing to do is go verse by verse. And so that's what I plan to do. And we won't get that far tonight, but we will get some distance into the book. 1 Corinthians 7. Concerning the things whereof ye wrote me, that is true that we've already found that Achaicus and Fortunatus were the ones who brought the question to the Apostle Paul, if I'm not miscorrect. Yeah, in 1 Corinthians, the 16th chapter and the 15th verse. He says, I beseech you, brethren, you know the house of Stephanatus, that it was the first fruits of Achaia, and that they have addicted themselves to the ministry of the saints. And it was here that in verse 17, I was glad at the coming of Stephanatus and Fortunatus and Achaicus, for that which was lacking on your part they have supplied. They had come to Rome to find Paul. He was in the maritime prison, and he was there held. And they had questions in the church at Corinth that they didn't have the answers to. Paul had not gotten to these things when he was there as its teacher and instructor, and so knowing where Paul was, and it could have been that there would be many ways they could have found that out, that they sent to Paul with these questions, knowing that he would be there. It was an advantage, really, which we don't understand, but we can, that Paul was located in one place, even though it was prison. And as he was there in prison, the brethren would know where he is. And so they could send somebody to the Apostle Paul, ask questions, receive the answers, and these faithful brethren would come back with the answers that would be satisfactory because of the Spirit of God that had been given. So he said, you wrote me. What do we do about marriage? He said, I'm going to answer the questions as to the New Testament, the New Covenant, the new will of Christ. For this is the spirit of information that has been given and vouchsafed to me that the answers can be given. Now, I have to tell you, this is different than the law of Moses. I will also tell you, this is different than the patriarchal law. Although maybe you haven't paid any attention to it, let me just show you what I preached on last Sunday night. If you will look at the 39th verse of the 7th chapter, you should see a very familiar statement. For the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. Remember we talked about this when we talked about the law of the Old Testament starting in the Garden of Eden. Look at Romans the 7th chapter and the first verse. And we'll read it then. I'll show you. I just thought you might find this interesting because it is exactly the same thing as is translated that is given here. He says, know ye not, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. And it's 39th verse of 1 Corinthians 7, says principally the same. Nevertheless, because you've asked the question, here's the reason for marriage. It's to avoid fornication. Fornication is a different word. It's from the word porneia, which means a person who sells themselves in prostitution or is quite quickly involved in extramarital affairs. Now you say, well, that's getting to the extreme in a big hurry. Well, the thing is that the Holy Spirit knew the end result, because people that begin to be feeling that they are free to be licensed to do things on a short term will soon find themselves to be doing them in a continual sense. And so he gets right to the end of the continual sense. Fornication will be involved. But he says marriage is this. Every man is to have his own wife, and every woman have her own husband. There was a lady, I was going into the bank the other day, and she came up and she was probably 2 sheets in the wind, had enough marijuana on her that you could smell it. And she was also drinking, and she came up and started drooling in her mouth and saying, you know, if you'll let me take you home, I'll make you feel like your wife never made you feel. I looked at her and I said, okay, but you've got to ask my wife first. Well, what do you mean I have to ask your wife? Well, the body you see me standing in doesn't belong to me, it belongs to her. This woman looked at me like I had the marijuana and that I'd been drinking the liquor. She said, do you mean to tell me your body belongs to your wife? I said, emphatically. What you don't understand is that's the law of Christianity. Now it says right here, if you'll read with me, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto her husband. The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband, understood, has that power. And likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife, understood, has that power. And when you become a child of God and you're married, according to the laws of God under the Christian dispensation, not according to the society under which you live, and there's a major distinction between the two that people don't understand. But the fact is that when you're married, your body is no longer yours. It belongs to the mate to whom you're married. And the twain are one. But the fact is that the mate to whom you're married is the one that has the control, the power, the say-so that will control your body. Now you say, well, I think that's kind of strange. Well, it's really not, because what happens is, if that's not true, you have what Paul speaks of next, and that's stealing. Verse 5, defraud. This is another way of saying you've stolen what doesn't belong to you. Now, there are a lot of times in a marriage situation where people don't understand what God has intended in the New Testament covenant, that stealing takes place. The way they steal is they withhold what doesn't belong to them that belongs to somebody else. That's called stealing. Defraud ye not one another. Don't take what's not yours and use it to your benefit. That's like if you have a red car and I have a black car, and I take your keys, I go off and take out in your car. You may not appreciate it since you made the down payment or making the payments. And you can take me to court and show that the car did not belong to me, so therefore I was guilty of stealing. When a person is married, as according to the commandment of Jesus Christ in the covenant that he gave, not according to the society under which we live, because that has the rules that determine when marriage begins and ends. But when they are married in that sense, they're not to steal. If they do, if they withhold themselves, now you're withholding what doesn't belong to you if you're the husband, because it belongs to the wife. You're withholding what doesn't belong to you if you're the wife, because it belongs to the husband. This idea that you hear a lot of times about people having headaches, or people not feeling good, or people this or people that, this is actually stealing. And the Bible says, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor with his hands to do that which is good. So the fact is that we're commanded not to steal. And if you do, he says, if you withhold your body, or your wife refrains to allow you to have her body that is yours by command, do it with consent, and only for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. This would allow you to have a sacred time of devotion and consistency in being involved in depriving yourself of other things than sex. There would be also the deprivation of food that you would be dependent upon, which would be something that is what you determine as a person that is serving God in a way more sensibly than other body. And then also, while you're doing these things, pray. Why? Because Satan is standing around watching you. He says, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency, or your lack of continuity, or your lack of continual relationship. Because if you deprive or take from somebody that is not yours and cause them to do without, you are the one who forces them to sometimes break the rule and disobey the law of God. It has always been my concern when people are involved in marriage as to who is guilty of causing the sin. A lot of times the one who is guilty of the cause is not the one who is seen to be guilty in the action. And because this is true, what our brethren have determined is called the guilty party, and I've never seen that written in the Bible, by the way, but they quote it as though it's there. The guilty party is probably not the one who caused the problem, but because of their lack of ability to constrain themselves, or their anger because what was theirs had been taken from them, or the idea that they had stolen from them what was theirs, caused them to say, I'm just going to show you what I can do. You're not the only man or the only woman in the world. I'll go involve myself with those that I want to, and I will show you that I can do what I want to do. He says you don't do that. Incontinency is not a good idea unless you're mature enough to control your passions. He says, and by the way, verse 6, I speak this by permission and not commandment. Now the permission that he had was the Holy Spirit. The fact that he wrote concerning this is something that is also true as we read in other places. I think if you'll turn to the book of 1 Corinthians, the 14th chapter, according to what I remember, understanding the scriptures and reading them, it says, and you who, if any man think, verse 37, 1 Corinthians 14:37, and our brethren don't have a problem with this verse, so we'll go to the one they don't have a problem with. If any man speak or think himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that I write unto you are the commandments of the Lord. So let's go back and use what Paul says by, I speak by permission. I speak the commandments of the Lord. So he says, I speak the commandments of the Lord. This is not what Christ commanded. Now, to show deference to what Christ commanded would be something that Christ would have discussed in other covenants by those who had given other laws. But since it was the apostles who were given the right, or the mediation, or the place of angels, or the place of the emissaries of God in the New Testament to write the New Testament commandment, Christ had not spoken on these subjects, but were things that the Jews had already understood. But And remember, he was not writing to a congregation that was totally Jewish, because these people were Gentiles. And under their line of thinking, a lot of the rules that were effective amongst the Jewish people had never been involved in the Gentiles. So he says this is according to the law of God. Verse 7. He says, now everybody is different. I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. You see, this is individual. It's hard to put a hard, fast rule for an individual situation as though it is something that fits every application. Now, when Jesus was teaching under the law of Moses, he made this statement. Turn back to Matthew 19. And again, it's a verse that's not often brought into your thought or your hearing. But in Matthew, the 19th chapter, Jesus was talking about those who were eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Now, they were those who controlled their self and suppressed this desire of physical relationship because of their love for God. And he says these were called eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. But then there were those who were eunuchs who had no desire for a woman or a woman for a man, who were eunuchs because they were born that way. And he says those situations have to be understood. So he said, all men, verse 11 of chapter 19, cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it applies, or it is given. So these things are individuals. Now, our brethren make rules that just apply to everybody across the board. They make themselves marriage counselors. They put themselves in a position and they write rules and regulations that they say are things that have to be followed. The sad part about this is, first of all, who was the one that caused the heart to be broken, the dependency to be separated, the oneness to be gone, and the sin to be committed? Jesus said, he that looketh upon a woman to lust after her in his heart hath already sinned. If she has done that, and she has defrauded, and she has stolen, or if it is him, and he has kept back that is his, and stolen, and this woman is in need of this as for physical fulfillment and disobeys the law, she committed the act that he created. And therefore, who's wise enough among us to be able to determine that? Now, I've talked to couples and I've talked to a lot of people, and they are at first hesitant to describe the situation that has brought about the breakdown in the marriage. But generally, when you get down to the situation, it is something that was caused by the person who didn't commit the physical act. Yet the person who committed the physical act is the only one that's ever punished. And that is contradictory to the statement that the Lord made. All right, so in verse 5, defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. I speak this by permission and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as I. Now, Paul, how were you? Well, he says, I've got a different gift. This gift was a special gift of mine, given me by the Lord because I'm an individual. What was this gift? He did not have to have physical relationship with a woman in order to be satisfied and at peace with himself in his life. It is a Greek word, which is, if you want to know it, charismata, which was a special gift given by Paul that allowed him not to have these problems. There are some men I know that are that way. There are some men that I know are the opposite of that. Each individual situation is determined by the makeup of the person. And you have to be pretty astute to determine whether or not and what is the situation that's under discussion. But needless to say, there's one thing you must understand. The reason a man is the way he is and a woman is the way she is. They are that way as far as desire and need for fulfillment in a sexual manner because of Christ. You say, well, why is it because of Christ? Well, if there had not been the need for physical intercourse, which would cause and bring into existence the continuation of the species, the means through which God had provided for Christ to come into this world would have not existed. So the question you can ask yourself is, has God laid a trap for us? And if he laid a trap for us, is it our fault because we fell into the trap? Well, this is what Paul is discussing with these Corinthian brethren. As I discussed with you last week, they trying to follow the Apostle Paul and he tells them to do that here in this chapter, as he was not with his wife, they thought that maybe one of the qualifications of a preacher of the gospel was not to be with the wife that they had married from their youth. Now we know that this is something that they involved themselves in because of the way the questions was asked. So in verse 7, he said, I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, another after that. I have known preachers of the gospel that did not have a need for a physical relationship with a woman, and they stayed in the situation that they came into this world in, and therefore had no need for a woman. I've known the opposite extreme to exist. And because this degree of change can take place, the thing has to be with the individual. And who makes the decision? They came because of species and because of progeneration, and had the desires and the overwhelming compunctions that was given them by those who brought them into this world. You didn't get to vote on it. It was just something that you had. How you handled and developed it, like it is with any other thing, you will be judged by. There are people who think physical stealing of taking stuff that doesn't belong to them is okay. There's people that think taking life is okay. There's people that have broken other laws that they've decided that it doesn't have anything pertaining to them. But that's not true. Such is the case in this situation. So now, in verse 8, he says, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows. Now the unmarried is the agamos in the Greek language. These are those that are not at this time in a marriage relationship. I don't know what relationship they were in, but you know that a man can't be a widower and a woman can't be a widow unless they had been married to become such. Yes or no, right or wrong. So you don't have to question what he's talking about. You just read. He says they were unmarried, or we call those a widower, or they were unmarried, and we'd call them widows. If they are in that situation, it is good for them if they abide, even as I. Now, what you have to add, the reason it is better for them or good for them, because of the certain situation or the present distress or the changing of the fashion of this world that we're going to be going through by the fall of Jerusalem. You see, everything has a consequence on everything else. Paul says, I'm going to save you the problem if you'll listen to me. It's going to be, if you're married, as though you're not. You're going to be running and you're going to be fleeing and you're going to be hiding and you're going to be this. And it would be as though you're not married even if you were. because those things will not have time to develop or take place. So what you really are not involved in, you're not shouldn't punish yourself, because it's going to be as though it didn't happen. But anyway, verse 9. But if they cannot contain, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. Now the reason they would burn is because the lust would cause them to break the barriers of decency and the commandment of God to not be involved with a fornicator, as we find in 1 Corinthians 6, and therefore they would be in sin. And if you die in your sin, Jesus said, whither I go, you cannot come. Verse 10, and unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Now the commandment of the Lord was something, of course, that the Apostle Paul had been instructed in, or had he? Yes, he had, but by Christ himself? Now that's a question that you've got to have more wisdom than I to answer. Did Christ go over these things with Paul in Galatia, or did Christ teach them as by the covenant of Moses from Sinai? Well, this agrees with the law that Paul was taught as a Jew, which came from Sinai. To the married, let not the wife depart from her husband. Why would he have to bring this subject up? Well, you see, if they saw Paul as the example, if he was their hero, if he was the one they were trying to follow, and they knew Paul had a wife, where was she? Why wasn't she traveling with him? Now, can you imagine the Apostle Paul taking about his wife and having no certain place to dwell, no clothes to wear, no food to eat, all of the things that he did without, being beaten in prison and imprisoned, being incarcerated in jails, being rebuffed and made the filth and offscouring of the world, and him be just as willing and as free and as responsive to the law of God to do that if his wife was there being abused in this way. They tell us that the last emperor of Rome was the meanest man that ever lived. Somebody will say, well, no, that's Nero. No, I think this old boy had one on him. It is said that he would bring Christians before them, and he would tell them to deny Christ and fall down and worship him as God. If they did not, he would bring the man's wife beside him. And in front of the man, he would have someone exercise his physical authority over his wife. Or he would have someone cut off her right arm. Or he would have somebody start putting out her eyes. Now that's just about as mean as he can get. But he even went worse. If they had children, he would cause these children to be brought before them, the man and his wife. Now you can stand a lot of things, but could you stand to see your child dismembered? Would you not think in your mind as a rational being that you would do any and all things, whatever it took, to cause that child not to be parted in your presence? And this is what he would do to cause people to deny that Jesus was the Son of God. Now, God's not stupid. He knows there is a point beyond which you cannot travel. He knows that there is a place that you cannot go. And so he wanted to save these Christians in Corinth because of the present distress, because of the changing of the fashion of the world, because of the physical situation that would come about, this kind of problem that they would find themselves in. And so he was writing to these brethren from that standpoint, as the scriptures are shown, To the unmarried I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. Basically, why would she depart? It's going to be in a few days as though she doesn't have one. So why to go to the trouble? Verse 11, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the wife let the husband put away his wife. What's the reason? What's the purpose? So you caught her in adultery or fornication. So you caught her in doing something that she shouldn't do. Why divorce her? It's not going to be so long down the road. That's going to be a short period of time that it's going to be as though she's not your wife anyway. And if she departs, let her not marry again. Why? Well, because the divorce court hadn't given her divorce papers? No. It's because there's no need. The purpose of it is no longer there. We have to remember that the circumstance and situations amongst these brethren was not like it is amongst us. A woman who was not married didn't eat. She didn't have a place to sleep. She didn't have clothes to wear. She couldn't go down to the 7-Eleven and get her a job, or Walmart. She just absolutely did without. If her parents happened to be non-Christian, she couldn't go there for the purpose of eating. She'd just starve to death. Well, there wouldn't be the length of time that was necessary, so what Paul was saying, if he depart, or if she depart, stay unmarried, or, if you can, reconcile the situation with the husband or the wife. And if you are the man who can bring about the divorce, which the wife in this society that we're reading about could not, if you were the man, let him not put her away, or that is, divorce her. But to the rest speak I not the Lord. Now this is where, because of the length of time, we'll stop tonight, but we'll continue this the next time we get together. You say, well, I've never heard this before. Well, it's been here for 2,000 years. This has been taught by very few people, and the reason they have involved themselves in all these other covenants is that this covenant under which we live has a whole lot of more constraints and rules and regulations, and are not as simple. And then there's another thing that's directly involved. We don't have too many Solomons around. We don't have too many Josephs that exist. Remember the situation with Joseph and Potiphar's wife? Joseph did something that was unbelievable. And he said, I knew that God was there. Where did Joseph learn this? He didn't learn this from the patriarchal age, although he was a part of that. He didn't learn this from the Mosaical age. He didn't live that long. The Christian dispensation was something that would teach this later on, but Joseph had nothing to do with this. This was the instinct and the nature that God had placed amongst men that men refused to follow. Solomon, you remember the two women that were sleeping in the same room? Today we don't have this problem either, because usually every woman has a place to sleep in her own house. She was sleeping in the same room. Were their husbands gone to war? Well, if they were, they weren't their husbands, because David had given them the right of divorcement if they had gone to war. That is, the men. Were they sisters? Were they whatever they were? It doesn't say. But the point is that one of them in her sleep rolled over and suffocated and killed her child. And the other woman woke up and found that she'd killed her child, and so in greed and in desperation, she reaches over and gets the child of the other woman who's still alive and claims it as her own. Now, they didn't say, well, we'll take care of this, we'll get a DNA test. Or we'll go try their blood. Or we'll this, or we'll that. Solomon was one of the wisest men that ever lived. And so they brought this before Solomon, if you remember the story. And when they brought this before Solomon, Solomon says, this is easy. Where's the baby? They reached the child of Solomon. He drew out his sword. Began to cry and scream that the child be not harmed. The other woman, who had no compassion or feeling for that child, didn't say a word. Solomon said, I know right quick who this child belongs to, and gave the woman back her child. We don't have too many Solomons. Not many wise are called. And so therefore, in working with the children of God in the Church of Christ, we have to do what God has commanded us, because He's taken away from us the demands that would determine that we'd have to be marriage counselors instead of gospel preachers. We'd have to be psychiatrists instead of those who are trying to win the lost. And our job is not to go into all the world and counsel people in marriage. It's to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, which in fact is he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, which are the commandments of the Lord, which if there's a need will you come, as we stand and sing.